On this episode of Marketing Against the Grain, we're going to go behind the scenes with one of the best creators in the world, Steph Smith, and she is going to tell us how she's been so successful in content, the 6 principles that she's used, and how we apply all of this to growing the hardest thing in the world, a podcast. Let's dive into today's show. Hey, Steph, welcome to the show. We're happy to have you back on again on Marketing Against the Grain.
I'm stoked to be here.
Sorry, I sound like a radio DJ there.
We're keeping that in.
Are you having a rough day? I don't know what I'm doing there. Hey, Steph. Okay, sorry. All right, Steph, you've grown all kinds of content, right? We worked together briefly at HubSpot. You were set up the creator program, have done all incredible stuff in your career, all kind of through the lens of content. You're an incredible creator. What we want to try to do in this show is teach people how to be like Steph, and then convince them whether they should actually apply those things to launching a podcast, because podcasts are really hard. And we want to see if any of the skills that we have learned as content creators have applied to us growing a podcast. So we're doing Marketing Against the Grain. You're doing the A16 and Z podcast, which is incredible. I'm a subscriber. And so that is the show. You think it's a good show, Steph, because you're a podcast?
Well, I'll make one modification. We don't want people to be like me, but I will try to share what I know about the content sphere, because it is tough.
Yes. I don't know, Steph. You're like one of the most interesting people I know.
Really?
So you have such a broad range of knowledge and experience. You're super interesting. Don't sell yourself short.
I'm just a good marketer.
This comes back to we had a Greg Eisenberg on, and we were going through like how people can build a business through content, like starting at video, newsletter, going to community, paid community. And actually the very first topic we talked about is like, you have to be interesting. Like in today's world, I know that sounds simplistic, but you have to be interesting. Your Twitter feed is really interesting because it's pretty diverse in the things that you cover. So why don't we start there? Like, did you as an interesting person, do you have to cultivate that? And do you believe that's true to be great at content?
Yes, I do. Loaded question. I do. I think if anyone doesn't think they're interesting, they're something's going on. They got to reorient their life. But yeah, I think I started with Twitter a while ago, and Twitter to me was just this outlet for me to share the things that I wanted to say. Like I had this deep urge to say, like, I was learning to code and to let people know, and to also like scream to the rooftops that other people should do the same. And so it really started as not a distribution mechanism for like some future business, but really just for my inner need to say something. And then what over time happened is, because I never really had to utilize Twitter as a platform to actually go make money, it was able to evolve with me. And that's why you see all these like sporadic, disparate things surface, whether it's like used to be coding, then it was at one point like really centered around remote work, then it was trends, and now it's, you know, a whole bunch of other things. But most creators do get stuck at that stage, right, where they become the X guy or X girl, and then they never leave that. And then I think to your point about whether it's curated, I think on the back end, I do need to lead an interesting life, but I also like am very, very specific about what I read, the newsletters I subscribe to, the podcasts I listen to, and I guess the way I spend my internet time. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yes, I do think that your outward Twitter feed is inevitably a reflection of the way that you spend your day to day.
I think it's also a little bit even more than that, Steph. I saw over the weekend that in Florence, there's a new exhibit of they found this cavern under one of the buildings in Florence that was basically Michelangelo's drawing room, that he would just like sketch drawings of different statues he's considering and everything. It's just, so you have all these kind of random half completed sketches all over that. And I think if you're going to make stuff, you have to have like a testing ground. You have to have a sketch pad. The beauty of something like Twitter is that you actually get feedback on it versus it being in a metaphorical cave or in a notebook or anything like that. And so when I look at your Twitter feed, I look at it a little bit like that. I'm like, oh, this is like kind of Steph's sketchbook, where she's working through ideas in public that then might show up on a podcast, might show up someplace else. Is that kind of how it feels or not?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think one of the fundamental amazing aspects of the fact that we live in 2023 is the fact that we can get that bi-directional feedback. 20 years ago, you would ship a blog post and you'd be one of the first to do that, and you'd get such simple data, if any. And then prior to that phase, 20 years before that, if you wanted to publish something in a newspaper, all you would know are the like raw sales of that newspaper, right? Like to everyone. You wouldn't know exactly what articles they're reading. You wouldn't know how far they got along. You wouldn't be able to test, as you just spoke to, the idea for an article that you maybe would want to invest in. And so today it's just this incredible ecosystem where you can post something not just on Twitter, on Reddit. There's tools where you can see what people really care about. And so you can not only test your own ideas, but you can also borrow other people's ideas that are pre-vetted. And these like pipes of the internet are incredible. And it's surprising to me that more people don't use that testing ground.
This is actually really fascinating. So one of the things I've been spending some time on recently is going back and just looking through personalization through the ages, like starting with first ads. And Kipp had a really good example of the cowboy delivering
the original Pony Express ad is like one of the best ads ever.
Yeah, one of the best, the Pony Express ads, right from the 1860s. And just like going back through time of like how you got feedback on the content that you put out. And one of the things that has happened, right, is that we have this reduced feedback loop. And you could actually make a case that there's a lot of pros and cons to that. Some of the cons are actually that you switch up things really fast based upon the feedback you get. And things become much more polarized because you get feedback so quickly. You're like, oh, geez, I need to be more like this or more like that. But one of the lessons within there I kind of wanted to come back to, because I think it's an important first lesson if someone is trying to start out a content or be better at content is kind of this idea of picking your lane, right? You called it like being the X guy or the X girl, or I can't remember what they call themselves on Twitter, but having like your niche, right? Having your thing. And I think one of the reasons I would have always sucked at being a creator is because I've always found it really hard to stick to a single thing. Like I remember when HubSpot, when we did the product-led growth thing, and I learned by creating content. People think I create content just because I want to get engagement, but I actually need to distill it into writing and put it out in the world. That's how I kind of learn about things. And so when I was doing the product-led growth thing, that was the first time I got a ton of traction. Like everything was blowing up in my inbox. I could feel it. Like I was one of the few people creating content about it. I could feel like this whole swell, tons of consultant advisory asks, all these different asks. And as soon as there was like, I think it was like creator economy, like I got fascinated by that. I got fascinated by Web3. I switched lanes like really quickly. I was like, oh, I'm on to the next thing. Like there's a bright, shiny object over here. I need to go learn about that. So how do you think about that if we're giving advice to people who want to excel at content today? Do you have to stay in your lane, like to cultivate that audience? How have you thought about that?
No, I actually don't think you need to stay in your lane. And I think there are a few tried and true creator pieces of advice. One of them is like, always be consistent. Another one is, like pick a lane and stick to it and become known for that and the, top tier expert for it. And those do work. Like there's a reason people share those pieces of advice. But if you especially are an independent creator, like you're not trying to build some massive business in a specific industry like, fashion or travel or something like that, then I think actually what is more compelling is people adhering to the way you think. And so you should be able to, no matter what topic you're talking about, describe the way that you share your content. So some people are really approachable. Actually, that's what a lot of people tell me is they're like, oh my gosh, when you were talking about learning to code, I saw myself in you. Like all of a sudden, all these other people who are really technical, they've been saying it for years, never struck chord. The way that you package things is approachable. Other people are just like really, really unfiltered. And that appeals to a certain group of people, right? They're like, you're telling it like it is. Finally, I've been looking for someone like you forever. And, other people are super technical, right? So like there's different ways that you can share content. And if you think about the people who don't just have these like growth spurts that disappear on a platform like Twitter, it's because you've grown to like them more so than, any slice of the content they shared for a period of time. So I actually think that if you have this really long time horizon as a creator, you absolutely can and probably should evolve because your audience is also evolving, right? If you take, she's all over the news, but like if you look at Taylor Swift, her tour is literally called the Eras Tour because she reinvented herself so many times over. And look at where she is versus the people or the musicians that came out with one album, it hit, they forever reproduced that album, and then they lost their audience because they're like, we already know that. We need something new.
Right. You picked Kipp's favorite marketer.
Taylor Swift. Come on.
She's an incredible marketer.
Well,
billionaire.
The other thing that I would just say that I think T Swift's good at. I think all the really good creators they're very good on taking and acting on feedback, right? I think a lot of those creators or artists, whoever you want to say, who don't evolve, they have this like sense of vanity, right? Like they don't want to hear the bad stuff about themselves because they just like, they can't accept it. The best people are like, oh yeah, you're right. I could be better at that. Yeah, you're right. That was kind of boring when I did that one. And it's like the feedback loops that you are offered now as a creator is so important. And it's one of the reasons I see like the best creators I observe, they have one core platform, whether it be a podcast, YouTube channel, newsletter, whatever, but they have some type of social channel where they're getting that kind of real-time feedback that they're going and flowing through to whatever they're working on at the time.
I would also say there is an aspect of, you guys said, like someone has to be interesting. You have to have a point of view. And there are simple examples even in Taylor Swift, or like, Kipp, I'm with you. I've been a fan for a while. And if you go back, like she got flack for cutting her bangs because people were like, that's not you. People were like, you're a country star. She was like, no, I can actually do pop. I can do folk. I can do rock. Like she's done all of the genres now. And I think that is important. A lot of creators, you need to listen to the people, the users, the consumers of your content, or you could also say the algorithm, but you also need to be able to make a decision to be like, no, like I think this is interesting. I'm going to work on this project for 3 months, even if my original tweet about it didn't get as much love as I was expecting.
I think that's the magical point in this stuff. It's like you have to have a point of view, and your point of view shapes who you listen to.
Yes. Yeah.
You can hear everybody, but you're like, oh, these people over here, I understand what they're saying. It's just counter to my point of view and my worldview, and I think I'm right. So I'm going to keep going down this path, but I appreciate and like understand their like concerns, right? And I think if you don't have a point of view, then you listen to everybody and you just get pulled in 100 different directions.
Exactly.
There was another important thing you said in there that's come up a couple of times with other people who are incredible at creating content, creating things that just get a ton of traction and engagement. And it's being able to vocalize or verbalize the things that are in people's head that they've not been able to say themselves. Like you said it, like, oh, someone, wow, I've always felt this way, but I haven't been able to articulate that. I've always thought this, but I've never been able to like put it in the words that you put it. That's an art, but it's also like being able to say the thing, right? I actually do think the point of view is like, part of it is like, how do I encapsulate the things that people always have wanted to say and like put them into words, put them into video, put them into audio? And do you cultivate that in any way? Like, throughout your kind of content career, how has research played a role? Have you just known what to create because you're living in this sphere that you're creating content or the people for? Or have you like integrated research in some ways into your content habits?
No, I mean, I do a lot of research. I joke to people. They're like, how do you create so much stuff? And I'm like, I just spend a lot of time online, honestly. But I mean, as part of that, I think even back to the very first pieces of content, which were blog posts that I put online other than Twitter. And they were all about remote work. And it was because I had been working remotely for several years before that. I had led, sizable teams. And I just felt like there was this part of the world that didn't understand this concept. They were misguided. They thought it was like this social phenomena where a bunch of people wanted to like live on the beach and not work. And I was like, no, there's something concrete here about the technical progress. And I only knew that because I'd been doing it for years, right? And it bubbled up, right? And so I think sometimes when you package something really nicely, a lot of people are like, oh, it's because you're like a really good writer. And maybe that's the case if you've been doing it for a while. But I also think if you've been studying something or living something for long enough, you understand all the contours and you understand the likely pushback or the likely misunderstandings. And so that's why you can kind of like take 3 years of thoughts and put it into, 170 characters, right? So like, I think that's a part of it. And then I also think as you get those reps in and you get validation that, okay, actually my thoughts are interesting, then there's a level of courage where you also see things that other people aren't willing to say. And over time, I think as a creator, you kind of like increase that courage level. And then, by the way, I do think it comes back down as your audience gets to a certain size, because then you just have so many eyeballs on you that you're like, oh, I can no longer say the things that I once did.
There's a really important part in that we've talked about before in the show, which is like part of being an entrepreneur is being okay with failure. And I know it's not to the same extent, but because content has such quick feedback loops and those feedback loops are very public, you do learn a lot that like it's okay to put things out there that no one seems to give a shit about.
Yeah.
Like If the first 10 times you put out content and you're like visibly there's no likes or engagement and you're like a sensitive person, you're probably going to stop. You're probably like, oh, I totally suck. And you kind of just have to put in the reps, right? Like part of it is when people have asked me, a lot of times people have asked me, do I need to build my personal brand to be really incredible in the field that I want to be incredible at? Because they see what's going on and they see like incredible CPOs and founders, like especially founders, right? We talked about this in the last show. Shamath, who's a billionaire, is talking up his like little subscriber product that he's going to sell on X, right? This is a billionaire.
I did see that.
Like,
Yeah.
come on, man.
But everyone gets the gratification for creating something and getting such feedback loops that people like it. But I think that's one of the things I've told people is you have to have lived the life to have something interesting to say. So if you want to talk about marketing, sales, or anything like that, I think you could start from day one. But just know until you have deep expertise, you have some real knowledge, you have some real scars, you've like really grinded it out, it's going to be hard for you to like say anything too differentiated, too interesting from what everyone else is saying.
Exactly.
I kind of disagree with that. Like if you're
Okay,
willing
go for it.
to show your learning and failures in real time, you can have interesting things to say.
That's true.
But you're doing the work.
Yeah, if you're doing the work, but it might be the first work you've ever done and you can still do it. Like you were kind of saying, hey, you need to go do
that's
some
true.
work
That's true.
and then
I
come
get
back.
you.
And it's like, I disagree
yeah.
with that. You have to do
Yeah.
some work because
Yeah.
the magic of being a creator is, Steph, I'm interested in your take on this. For me, there's this creator loop of like, oh, I do something, so I want to create about that. But then because I create about it, I want to do it more. And it like starts like, it increases the velocity of your work to be a creator, I think. Do you find that to be true, Steph?
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's the dopamine hits are real, right? And especially if you're building in the open and you're like, oh, all of a sudden, like if I spend this much time building a product, like, and people care, then, I'll do it even faster. Actually, a quick story on this. I taught myself to code. I spent, 6 months or so learning before I shipped my first thing on Product Hunt. Then I got so much positive feedback that I did it in a month because I did this 1 month challenge. Then I did a 24-hour startup challenge, right? So that's a perfect example of where I literally was like, I need to do this more and more and more and quicker. And you do chase those dopamine hits for sure. But I do think it is a positive thing that you get this feedback cycle. And especially if you're creating content around the things that you truly want to do, which I would argue not all creators do, then yeah, it's a perfect cycle. Like I can't imagine, how you could better design it for that purpose to motivate yourself.
I've met people who are able to do two things that I will never be able to do. First of all, they can, like at the start, we've talked about picking a lane and that you either pick the lane or you can evolve over time and hopefully your audience stays with you and doing something that you're truly interested in. So like I've met very successful people who are making a lot of money selling online products. And they just do the same audience time and time again, like it's the same lane, and they are creating content on something they have zero interest in. Mm-hmm. And I have actually some deep respect for that.
I can't think of much more of a miserable life than that.
But I don't know, like it depends if you just like look at it in a way where the process is the part that you're interested in, right? They're like very process orientated, know how to like turn all the knobs to optimize the funnel, to create the money, and people buy all these products. And you care about the outcome, which is like a really great lifestyle because you're very, very rich. The problem I've always had is like not being distracted by like the thing that is interesting at that point in time. Like I just like, oh, this is the thing I'm interested in. So I'll go deep in there and write content about that. But there's like, I guess there's two ways that you can approach that. You can pick the lane, be very dedicated to it, or you can just care about the process and care about the money coming at the other end.
I can't do it either, Kieran.
Yeah,
if that
same.
helps. Like it just like, if you're an interesting person, you have things that you're like truly drawn towards. Like it like sucks your soul to not be able to invest your limited time into those things versus something that, may be more lucrative, but it just isn't enduring.
I'm actually doing real work here because I want to apply these to a podcast. So we had, do you have to pick a lane, the quick feedback loops, do you have to have a point of view, how you can vocalize what's in someone's head. One thing I wanted to touch on research because we have to integrate AI into every episode. How much have you used AI in Steph, like how much have you used AI to ship content and in your research process? So if we break content down into like, I've used AI and actually shipped something the AI has wrote, and I've used AI to actually research something that I shipped.
Less so in research. The ways that I have used AI for sure for research are if I don't understand something, so it's perfect for like, I had to like interview someone about like quantum mechanics, and like he's like helped create the James Webb Telescope, and you know, we're talking about dark matter. I'm like, I don't quite understand this. So I definitely used ChatGPT to be like, can you break this down as if you're like SpongeBob SquarePants, or like as if you're, you know, I'm a third grader. And it was really good at that. So I've used it for that purpose. I've also used it sometimes to almost like prompt me to create better questions. So I've definitely like asked it, hey, can you generate some questions for this interview? They tend to be pretty placeholder, not super interesting, but that almost sets the bar for me to do better, right? So that's the way I've used it in research for the most part. We've also used it for fun little segments, like we did an episode on AI hardware, and at the end it was like this fun fact from ChatGPT about itself. So that's the limit though. In terms of actually shipping the content though, definitely have used it to brainstorm titles, descriptions, things like that. So I don't know, I feel like I've listened to a bunch of both of your episodes and you use AI way more. So what am I missing there for this podcast? Is there a way that you use AI that I haven't mentioned?
I think the AI assistant, like an assistant writer, is, I've never shipped anything that AI has created, but I've used it to research a bunch of things and to assist in a bunch of things. Like one of the things I was showing Kipp earlier that I thought was really cool was I took a lot of customer call transcripts, and then I made a data file from that, and then I uploaded it into Zapier interfaces. Allows you to like upload a data reference file for the AI to use in that kind of AI chat, and use that to create copy, right? So like I could use it to upload 20 different calls, and I could say, hey, what's the commonality of phrases in the language used, and then apply that to like redraft this homepage strapline based upon customers' languages. But I'll tell you, like, what I was really surprised in, I was like, from those transcripts, I was like, tell me the 3 biggest problems that customers had to scale, and give me the 3 ways that they would like Zapier to overcome them, and articulate that in like a David Ogilvy style, right? Because they're looking for ad copy. It's really good. I was like, holy shit, this is actually really good. And so then I started giving it old ad copy, right? I give it the whole, like I started creating like a little historical bank of like David Ogilvy's like best ads. I did a post about this today, but one of his most iconic ads is this Rolls-Royce ad. Kipp already knows it because he's listened to a lot of
I
these podcasts.
I know exactly what ad you're talking about.
And it's something like, you know, at 60 miles an hour, you can't hear, all you can hear is
it's at 60 miles an hour, all you hear is the clock.
All you hear is the clock. And
so it's basically saying this car is so luxurious and quiet that the only thing you're going to hear is the clock on the dashboard ticking.
You know there's 2 incredible parts about that line. So the first incredible part speaks to something people miss when they want to write great copy, is the research. And so that line is taken from a technical specification doc. It's not something he wrote, right? He pulled it out of the specification doc. That single ad doubled the sales for Rolls-Royce. So it's a great example of like, if you can really find the thing that your customer will really resonate with, the copy kind of doesn't matter as much as actually the benefit. But also that so I took all of those ads and we broke down why they were good and bad in ChatGPT, and then we applied them to Zapier, and again, the output was very, very good, like worryingly good. And so there are some like ways that you can use it. Again, if you give it context beforehand, we've talked about this in the show before. Set whatever that training data is, like that little bit of training data that you want to use, it gets much, much better. I've
also used it, to your point, as a feedback partner. So like if I write something, I'll just be like, roast this. Or like where is this breaking down? Like, is this a good hook? Yes or no? And, you know, it'll give pretty thoughtful responses. And, you know, even to your point about like the Rolls-Royce ad, it's like that really encapsulated the product pretty well. And since we were talking about podcasts earlier, I wonder if you guys think about that for a podcast, because I think that's actually where a lot of people miss. Is they're like, they think of a podcast as like, you know, an interview style podcast about technology. And it's like, just imagine that as an ad. Right? And so it's like, they often forget, you know, the YC one-liner or how they differ. And so do you guys feel like you understand that about marketing against the grain?
Like Kieran and I have been doing a David Ogilvy deep dive recently, right? And the biggest Ogilvy thing is what you choose to feature matters much more than how you feature it, right? Like picking the right thing to feature matters the most. And I think we made a very kind of strategic choice in the name of the show, Marketing Against the Grain, that we're going to talk about counterintuitive things. And we're always going to talk about counterintuitive things related to marketing. So that's really the one-liner. And then I think about basically a year ago, I think, Kieran, you and I were on WhatsApp. We were like, wow, this AI thing is huge. And I think it's bigger than anybody thinks. And we need to make this a huge part of the show. I mean, it could probably be the whole show. We won't make it the whole show, but we're going to make it 70% of the show. And that's basically the path we went down, was to say, all right, our wrapper is to talk about things in a contrarian or counterintuitive way. And now the biggest opportunity to talk about those things is around AI.
Right. So if we start going through these and apply them to podcasts, I do want to talk about distribution, just agnostic of podcasts. But let me just, because this is like related to this, is how do you feel about pick a lane for a podcast? Because you said, hey, as a creator, you can evolve and your audience will evolve with you. I've struggled with, how do I make a hit podcast, marketing podcast? Kipp and I talked about this. You would just create the most actionable A to B to C of marketing that you can create, right? That's actually what a large portion of the audience want. But Kipp and I did not want to create that show, right? Like we want to create actionable takeaways, but not in the kind of ABCs of marketing, like a little more forward thinking, future thinking. And so that was a decision we made because of our interests, right? That comes back to I just can't create something I'm not interested in. But for a podcast, do you believe the same is true, that you can create a podcast and you don't have to have a lane? Because it's hard to market a podcast if you don't have that lane.
I actually think it's more true for podcasts than other forms of content. And I would actually argue that you guys, from my perspective, chose the right path, because I think a lot more people listen to podcasts for entertainment. They trick themselves into
This is my point. Yes, go Steph.
Telling themselves that they're listening for some sort of, there has to be enough of a hook that someone can convince themselves that I'm spending my time effectively. It's loosely about business or tech or marketing or whatever sphere they're in. But I actually think a framework that I often share helps cement this for people, where basically if you think about the different forms of content, podcasts are like your best friends, newsletters are like your coworkers, and then blogs are more like some stranger you meet at a conference.
Ooh,
and if you think about the information entertainment relationship, so the conference person, you're deeply related in terms of your intellect, and you're at a conference for a specific thing to learn something. That's what you clicked an article from Hacker News, you liked the headline, you wanted to digest just that. You don't care who wrote it. You're probably not going to subscribe to their website or their associated newsletter. And it's more of a transaction. It's more of that information. You don't care if it's entertaining. You're not laughing as you're reading the article, but that's okay. That's not what you came there for. The newsletter is this more like a coworker relationship. You're going to hear from them on a specific cadence more often than a one-off. You're still not best friends. There's some entertainment, you don't want to have a terrible time at work, but that's not the premise, right? And so newsletters are you choose your favorite creators and you expect to hear from them every so often, but you do expect that when you're spending the 3 to 5 minutes with a newsletter that you're going to get something back, right? You're going to get some industry analysis or something like that, or some news download. Podcasts actually get away with giving very little information and people being okay with it. And then if you also think about this time you spend on a podcast, if people have made it to this point, they've been listening to us for at least half an hour, right? And think about the equivalent of reading a blog post, which is a few minutes, if not shorter, because people often bounce, versus a newsletter is a few minutes per week. A podcast is some very, very significant jump up in the time you spend with someone. And so those are your best friends. Those are the people you go to every single week. You want to spend time with them. And quite frankly, think about if you had a best friend who was always coming to you with the best practices and I guess we all have a friend who does that, who's always biohacking.
Sure, know it all, friend.
And stuff.
You sit down, here's how you run a paid marketing campaign for this plenty of time. You're gee,
yeah. And you're I can get that at my conference, right? I can get that at work. What I like about you as my best friend is that we can hang out and talk about anything. And I like that you're funny or
yes,
relatable, or, again, some of those adjectives we mentioned earlier. And so I actually think, to come full circle, podcasts are actually the medium where I think you can constantly reinvent yourself if you are compelling enough as a person. And obviously that's a big caveat, but if you actually think about a lot of podcasts, like you mentioned Shemot, the All In podcast started different to what it is today. My
Right.
First
I
Million
agree.
started different to what it is today. And that's
Yeah.
because people liked the hosts, and then they could really do whatever they want after that.
Yeah, I think that is a great point. We talked a lot about this, Kipp, but the My First Million is a good example of a podcast that started with like a very good like angle, like how do you make your first million, and has no relation to that today, right? The stuff that they're doing is like way beyond that. So I think that is a really great lesson.
First of all, Steph, be prepared for Kieran to steal that framework and post it on LinkedIn this week,
Please.
because I can already tell that he's going to. Good job. Kieran's like, I've already half written the post. Gonna have AI
You
finish
plus
it up
AI,
for me.
it's done.
I'm a content regurgitator. That's my angle.
We all are.
But the cheat sheet for everybody watching and listening, though,
I feel like
is-
there's something in this from Kipp. Actually, should we just press on this, Kipp? Did I steal something from you and you want to get it out? There's definitely something in your comment that we should just hash it out on the podcast. What did I post of yours that you are slightly better about? Because there's definitely something there. Just hash it out on the podcast live.
It's actually nothing of mine. It's what's hilarious is that I have this like
I
intimate
definitely
front
posted
row.
some of your stuff.
I have this intimate front row seat to your life because we're so close that like every LinkedIn post you write is like, oh, I was there. I was in that conversation. Oh, he sent me that thing.
That is true.
It's just
That
like,
is true.
I feel like your LinkedIn post. I'm like, oh, that's my life from like a week ago.
Yeah. Friend. It's tell Kipp and then put it on LinkedIn.
Exactly. No, but I was just trying to double down for everybody listening and watching that, like, the macro of Steph's framework is the more your personality is exposed, the more flexibility you have in the topic you cover.
Yes.
Right?
Great
Like,
way to put
if you're
it.
very distant from your audience, then you got to stay in one very precise lane. If you're very intimate with your audience, you can cover a wide variety of topics. Right? And I think we've
Right.
seen that throughout time.
Right.
Kieran, do we want to talk about podcasts a little bit more now?
I'm actually going to go
Building a
through these now. So,
podcast?
so
Okay.
this was the first. I'm trying to go through these lessons and apply them to podcasts. So that was I think this is a really great
It is a really
example
good one.
of the pick your lane. The other one I want to talk about is feedback loops. So I actually think podcasts are somewhat hard to get quick feedback loops on, but short form, like one of the things that we hypothesized is that short form video might be a good way to get instant feedback on podcasts. I don't know if that's true now. Like we went viral for some things on TikTok, and I look at it, and I'm like, what the fuck are these Gen Z ones watching this shit for? like we had this segment on talking about a chicken waffle house. Like we talk about good stuff here. I swear to God, there's some good lessons. And then I look, there's this chicken waffle house thing that got 3 million views. That's nothing about nothing. And I'm like, I don't understand the internet anymore. It's finally happened. So what do you think for like, we talked about quick feedback loops and being able to create content in other mediums. How do you think about that for podcasts?
Well, I'll grant you that it's like definitely the hardest medium for that, right? Like the analytics are
So
terrible. And actually, I'm curious to know from you guys before I share maybe some techniques. Do you find clips work? Like, I think 2 years ago, they were a mechanism that a lot of people, or so I should say, not a lot of people were doing. So the few that were seeing outsized returns in terms of views. But now everyone has the same approach, no? Like the
Yeah,
same
same company did them
agencies,
all.
they all look the same. Yeah. So I don't know. I'm curious. Like we've definitely had some do well, but I would say on the whole, I question whether that approach is like, past its prime.
Well, I think there's a couple things in that. One, we should talk about audio versus audio and video podcasts, right?
Yeah.
Because I think when it's an audio only podcast, there's like no feedback loop.
Yeah.
The data
Yeah.
is really
Zero.
horrible.
Yeah.
It's super lagging. It's really tough. Steph, we're kind of the mind that clips can work, but where we think it's going is the like what Sean did for the All In podcast interview, that like great 2 to 5 minute video that catches the zeitgeist on something that you could put on YouTube and X and Reels and really do something, but it's kind of native to its own thing. It's not just like a 30-second clip out of the bigger show, is probably what we're going to start experimenting with, because it's like that feels a little bit more differentiated right now.
Right.
Yeah. And also pull someone in to the point where they actually would want to go jump to another platform or app.
Well, right. So, I mean, back to
lead
your friend
magnets.
analogy, like all those clips are super transactional. Like you can't
Yes.
get to know anybody unless like that's your whole business, right? You're a TikTok influencer and like you're spending all day on a 30-second clip.
It's literally like the equivalent of like you jumping out from behind a bush and being like, I'm here.
Yes.
And these people are like,
Subscribe to
I
my
only
show.
listen. Yeah. Like they're like, I only listen to 6 podcasts. Like I've got my best friends. This is not convincing at all.
By the way, that would kill on TikTok though. If somebody's TikTok, if you wanted a great TikTok channel, TikTok in real life, and all you did was recording yourself doing your TikTok
With
videos
ads.
to some stranger.
Okay, you can sponsor this person to jump out of a bush and surprise someone with your ad. I'm telling you, that would blow up. That would actually blow up. I do think this is a good example of like something works, gets saturated, you should do the very opposite thing, right? I think that's part of the problem. But actually, Kipp, your point, this is related to feedback loops, so just jump into it. Like, your perspective on audio versus audio and video, and then I would love to hear how you apply that to A16Z.
Yeah. So I totally agree with you, Kipp. Audio alone, even if you were to, I tweeted this a while ago, if you just put the analytics in Chartable or Simplecast or whatever you use versus YouTube, it's like you get probably around 3 metrics, which also, by the way, differ across apps for audio only. And then for video on YouTube, there's like 50, right? So that gives you a sense of just the fidelity and feedback that you get. So I do think for us, like we are on YouTube with all of our content for that reason, not just the feedback, but also the distribution that you get through YouTube.
If you were going to start a new podcast today, would you start an audio only podcast?
No. I do
wouldn't
have
either.
one with my husband, but that is not like a business. Like that is, again, starting from the perspective of just, I have something to say, and so let's make it the lowest lift possible. I'm solving for a different problem, but most people listening are not solving for the just, I want to say something with my husband. They want to build some
If you want
sizable
hundreds or
audience.
thousands of people to listen to you, you have to do video in addition to audio.
Right.
Yes. Although on YouTube, I'm curious how you guys do it. Something that I'm thinking a lot about these days is if you just record the way we're doing and then you just publish the, video version on YouTube, that's like the lowest investment. And then there's a second tier where you're like adding a bunch of B-roll and like lower thirds and you're doing a lot of cuts. And then there's a third version that we kind of talked about for shorts, but could apply to YouTube too, which is just like YouTube native content. Like you're not just repurposing the podcast, you're just creating stuff for YouTube.
Natively for,
And so I'm curious, like, how do you guys think about that? Because it's like the, 3x3, it's like the amount of investment, or 2x2, I guess, versus the expected outcome.
I will say the biggest thing that's changed about our show is, in the year and a half we've been doing it, is showing visual examples. So anytime we prep for a show now, we always have charts or some work that we've done, some graphic that we thought was super interesting, and we show those during the show. And then sometimes, thanks to producer Darren, it'll be cut into B-roll and maybe look better, and sometimes it'll just be kind of take over the screen for a little bit. So it's not the lowest lift, but it's not like this crazy high production value. And wow, do people on YouTube love visual examples. I could tell you for sure that
turns
they
out a
love
visual
them.
platform like visual aesthetics. Like I think that's the part of it is when I think of YouTube first is like, how does this appear on YouTube first? And then RSS is like the nice to have as well. But to Kipp's point, like the visuals, like trying to bring it to life in YouTube is much more important. We have found, like, I don't know how you've maybe found this in A16, and am I saying A16 and Z?
A16Z, yeah, and I realize I'm not ignoring your question. I'm happy to talk about
No, but
it.
one of the things we found actually is we do have some instances where a topic works really well on YouTube and works fine on RSS, and then a topic works really well on RSS and fine on YouTube. And sometimes we actually exported our data to Code Interpreter and ChatGPT and looked for commonalities in topics that were performing well, and looked for commonalities in topics that were performing completely different. And actually, there were some topics that performed very differently across those two things. So that's like one of the hard things about combining these. You see the same thing.
Yeah. And that's why, so it is tough because, so for example, something that worked pretty well for us is we did these AI hardware explainers. We did a series of 3 of them, but they're super visual. They work for the audio medium, but they're like these highly animated, like if you know Cleo Abram, we work with her, or someone who I think still works with her animator. And so those were created, you could say, for YouTube. So it's again that like YouTube first content that we happen to also publish on audio. And then we have other things where again it's like it's podcast first the way we're recording, and we just happen to want to use YouTube as a distribution mechanism. And I'm leaning more towards the former. YouTube first content these days, because that is where the distribution is, that is where the data is. And I find that the content that you create for YouTube applies better to the audio feed than the reverse, right?
Reverse, exactly.
Yes, but we found the
Exactly.
exact same thing.
Steph, you have grown audience for every single form of content that you could possibly grow for. Why don't you go on a rant about how fucking hard it is to grow an audience for a podcast, and give people the realness, and just tell us, like, what are some of the things that have worked and what are some of the things that have surprised you about growing such a like incredible podcast over there, A16Z.
So I should say, like, I came into A16Z pretty lucky. Like, the podcast did exist. So I've built other things from scratch, but I can't take credit for that. So yeah, first of all, it's really hard. Like, I think, you know, I joked the other day, there's nothing that unites me more with someone than going through US immigration. Number two is someone who has, you know, tried to grow a podcast. They know they've been through it all.
US immigration, the last 2 times have tried to take me into the little room. I don't know what is going on.
What are you hiding, Kieran?
I know. What am I hiding? I don't know.
So, and it's really, you know, not to reiterate the same thing, it's really because there's no distribution mechanisms, no obvious ones. And then second is, even if there are things that are working, the analytics are so bad that you can't even properly action or identify that most of the time. Unless you're sending something through a chartable smart link, it's tough. But I guess it also makes sense, because think about if you were to apply the exercise of like exponentially growing your number of best friends. That sounds strange, right? Sounds like a hard task at hand. So with all of that said, I guess a few things that have worked. I mean, perhaps unsurprisingly, cross promos are something that we do quite a bit of. And I think that is because it's almost like the cocktail party, right? If we're going to use the same analogy of like someone that's trusted is like bringing their trusted best friends into the same room and saying that this is, you know, someone worth spending time with.
You give an example of how that works, just for the listeners, so they understand how you co-promote a podcast.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously you want to be mindful of the people, like it's same thing. If you're running a dinner party, you don't want to just like invite some people that you don't actually know and like, but yeah, you basically work with other podcasts who have similar audiences, and then, you know, you vouch for, you hopefully also are listening to those podcasts again to make sure that you actually like them, and then you promote them. It's basically like an embedded ad within a podcast. So that's one method. There's also paid ads. I think I've reduced the amount that we're doing there, because those historically don't, you know, not just for A16Z, but I think they don't work super well.
They're not sticky subscribers.
The attrition is high. The thing I've seen even for my personal podcast that's worked the best is to use some of these other platforms, not just YouTube, to grow an audience, but also to seed ideas. So for example, for my own podcast, the best way we grew is like, if we did an episode about the 40-hour work week, I would tweet something that was, I don't know if you'd say it's controversial, but got a lot of engagement of a bunch of people being like, yeah, why the hell do we still operate in this paradigm? And then, you know, following up with clips in that thread. So again, like drawing the attention to something or getting the attention spurred and then following up. So none of this is rocket science, but I do think that is probably the best way I've seen to grow something, is to go on other platforms where you do have distribution and analytics, and then, you know, again, spur ideas there and then follow up with the podcast content. Of course, you just have to create a great product too. And I think if you create something shareable, that's word of mouth tends to be the best for podcasts.
There's like a tipping point where you start to get enough referrals that you can start to grow that way. The first one, actually, interestingly enough, Kipp, is probably why we originally thought about spinning up the podcast network, which is the best way to grow podcasts is through these embeddable ads, not even ads, but like recommendations for other podcasts. Yeah, that's how people... I discover that's the way I actually discover podcasts, is I listen to a podcast and they actually recommend another podcast or another episode of a podcast. So I think that works really well.
Yeah, and I think just like any product, it's like, how can you create shareable nuggets? So like one thing we've done over the last few months is there are so many podcasts that talk about technology. So one spin that I've been using more recently is like, we're not just the podcast that talks about technology, we show you, right? So we like did an episode in a self-driving car. We just did an episode where like I learned how to play basketball and dunk in VR.
I saw that as well.
So it's like,
that's really
that's
cool.
To me, it's like, you do have to, especially in 2023, think about the packaging. It's like, what does differentiate you? What is your one-liner? And I think that's something that we're working on. But like, I think a lot of podcasts probably, again, couldn't articulate that. They're just like,
Yeah.
we talk about tech. What do you mean?
I love that. Actually, that's a really good example. I've started to see you do that, which is like you bring it to life in a very visual way. I saw the drive you did in the car and the basketball game in VR. Very good at, you were a very good virtual basketball player.
Thank you.
And also, I think your podcast has bringing it to life in that way. And then you just have such dense amount of knowledge. Like I went through the entire, you turn an AI event into a series of podcasts. I went through every single one of those podcasts. So there's like ways that you can bring it to life in a variety of ways.
Which, by the way, I think tech in general, tech and business podcasts, you guys do a good job of this, but like most just are quite lazy, quite frankly, from the perspective. They're like, okay, let's just bring in big guests, which is great. And that's actually what most of the time people
ask them
want
their
to
life
hear.
story.
Obviously, that's a growth mechanism too. But and then they just hit publish. And if you look at many other industries, like true crime is one of the biggest in podcasts, the sound design, the production, like this is a product they're creating. And quite frankly, again, like a lot of the business and tech podcasts are lazy. So that was one of the first things I came in and I was like, let's elevate this. Like, let's make this sound great, which sounds simplistic, but I think it's actually crazily enough, not the norm in business and tech podcasts.
Yeah. People still don't think of it as a product. Don't think about the polish. Don't think about the ways that you need to kind of bring it to life for a consumer. This is awesome. Kipp, anything, we got everything? Anything left on
I
the
thought
table?
this was incredible. I thought this was one of our best deep dives for anybody who wants to be a creator or especially is thinking about launching a podcast or YouTube channel. It's amazing stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. And we'll see everybody really soon on Marketing Against the Grain.
Thanks, guys.
This data is wrong every freaking time.
Have you heard of HubSpot? HubSpot is a CRM platform where everything is fully integrated.
Whoa, I can see the client's whole history, calls, support tickets, emails, and here's a task from 3 days ago I totally missed.
HubSpot. Grow better.